Hello, everybody. Now, this is a webinar, so I'm not actually sure you're there. So I'm hoping that you've joined us. I've just been completely traumatized because my cat has just brought in a rather large baby bird. So I feel slightly in shock and very sad about that. But back to important things, and really happy to be here this evening on this Tuesday evening. Very nice to see you all. Thank you for coming. I just should introduce myself. Apart from being traumatised, I'm Jemima Burrill and I'm the curator of Now Gallery and the cultural consultant for Greenwich Peninsula. And this is our 7th in the Curator Talk series. And I'm just really glad that you're here for this one because I think it's really important. How good design works. Now Gallery is on Greenwich Peninsula, as some of you may know. And I think that we are really concerned with the importance of public space and good design. I commissioned a series of talks, a series of, in fact, seating, not talks, a series of seating by raw edges on Peninsula Square. And it was extraordinary. They're concrete seats, and we put them in the square and people immediately leant on them, sat on them, climbed on them, and they became a dwelling spot. And they actually sort of totally changed the whole nature of the space because people would actually stop. So we understand that design is really important. This talk is looking at this, but also more, I hope. And we have got Louise Grassov from Schulze+Grassov. And I've already talked to her business partner, Oliver Schulze, who I'm hoping that this time maybe we're going to get a female perspective, but we'll see. Welcome, Louise. Very happy to have you here. Thank you for. Now I've discussed where you are, and it's an island somewhere in Denmark, and it's lovely that you could join us. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jemima.
And you know about the Greenwich Peninsula. You are designing the spaces around the building in the design district. Now, for those of you who don't know what the design district is, it's actually our new creative space, and it has 16 buildings designed by 8 architects, and it's offering permanent and purposed design studio space for all. And I think for any of us who are kind of stuck in their homes working from a kind of upstairs bedroom, the idea of real studio space that's actually going to make life better and be well designed is really exciting. So I'm looking forward to you talking about that. And I'm also hoping that you're going to talk about Copenhagen, Berlin, and maybe St. Louis as well. So hopefully. And we'll also have Tom Lloyd talking. Hi, Tom. How are you? Nice to see you.
Very well.
All the way from Hackney, is that right?
That's right. Yeah, that's where I am.
So Tom is one part of Pearson Lloyd, and he designs aeroplane interiors, wayfinding, hospital signage, and really beautiful furniture. If you haven't checked out his furniture, you should. And he also designed some benches which we use frequently. They're one-to-one benches, and they're a sort of permanent feature at any of our events. They're very simple, long boxes which create a sort of approachable connection, and they carve up space so that people can kind of talk. Anyway, I'm assuming that you're going to talk a little bit more about these shortly, Tom, so I look forward to that.
I will be, yes.
Good. So we're going to have, just to sort of let you know how this is going to work, we're going to have presentations from Louise and then Tom. And I usually do quite a lot of butting in, but I'm going to try not to, but I probably will do a little bit. But we're going to have questions from me at the end. But we really want questions from you too. This is really important. We want you to join in. We want your thoughts. We want your ideas. So get on the Q&A and just, get talking. Magda is going to be feeding those questions to us at the end. So we want to hear from you because it's a little bit like being in a vacuum here. I don't know. Is there anybody out there? Yeah, we want to hear from you. And also Alicia's going to be sending through some links. So do look out for those because I think those will be useful. So we're going to start with Louise, who is going to look at a sort of bigger picture, the sort of wider city scale, and then Tom, who I think is more maybe on the human scale. And I hope they're going to discuss their work, but I also hope they're going to look at how design moves forward at this time, what with social distancing, public spaces and our parks being used to the max.
I'll do that. Thank you, Jemima. I'll get this thing going. So I'm hoping you all see my screen now. So I was just going to start with a short introduction on me. So I am a trained architect from Copenhagen, and I've worked in practice now for 20 years as an urban designer. And I'm also a visiting professor in Washington in landscape architecture and urban design. That's a bit of my background. And for the last 8 years, I've had my own urban design company called Schulze+Grassov. And I think for me, the key is really that it's a partnership. So it's with Oliver Schulze, my professional partner, and it's really I think the chemistry between the two of us that really drives our small studio. So yeah, it's not so much about me, but really about what Oliver and I have created together, I think. So urban development is really at the core of what we're looking at. Different scales, we like to both zoom in and zoom out. And I think when we talk about urban design, it's this thing that we're always discussing, what is urban design? But for me, I think it's the key to all urban development, that we need to be able to see across professions. So we can't just look at architecture in a silo, we can't look at landscape in a silo, we can't look at engineering, but we need to understand that cross through all of that. So I think what's really close to our hearts is a lot of urban research, looking at what is working, what's not, understanding our users. The whole idea of mobility planning and urban mobility, I think, is really interesting when we look at our cities and how can we be better at utilizing the limited space we have available and so forth. But all these things coming together, I think that's sort of core and center to our focus. So we are doing a lot of strategic guidance, framework planning, which I think is really close to my heart. I like looking at the bigger picture, and we like to work within framework planning instead of master planning. I've always had a bit of an issue with the idea of master planning. One master comes in, gives us the answer to everything. And I much more like the idea of the framework planning, where we especially as urban designers, can set up the frame for future development. Because I don't think, who would have known 2 years ago? Well, some might have predicted it, but who would have known 2 years ago we would be in the situation we're in now? I don't think we today can give all the answers for what the city should be in 50 years. So I think there's something really true about setting up a robust frame that really builds on what we know and allows us to continuously develop the city. So that's really core to my heart and the focus. But we also do public realm, so design of spaces and elements in the public realm. And I think what really is key, and what we come from a background of studying and working with Jan Gehl, is really the outset of understanding the user. Who are we actually planning for? Who are we designing for? Who are the people that will be, in the end, inhabiting these spaces? And I think, Jemima, also, if you're asking what will come out of, what have we learned from all this corona, I think that's something to come back to, that we now as designers, we need to be much more aware of our end users, because I think there is a risk now that we are designing for a certain group, and that's the one group that's confident with being in public space, but there is a risk that there's a much larger group now that don't see themselves as having a role to play in our public realm, either being afraid or not feeling that they're being understood and so forth. There's a lot of stuff happening globally, and I think that's really one of the things I think we need to be much more aware of our audience and who are we actually designing for. We cannot just keep doing what we've done so far, but we really need to understand what's going on in that sphere. So another thing, and you said this thing about the city scale, I think the neighborhood scale is really something that I find amazing. That's where we start to look at the relationship between things. And I think we've tried to develop a sort of a method of always looking at sort of a terminology where we always talk about the importance of understanding the network. So network of spaces, that being both streets and spaces as we understand them, sort of squares, but also understanding the individual hierarchy between those. So really, there's no need to have a network.
Has Louise frozen?
I think she has.
She has. Okay, I think we'll go on to Tom and we'll come back to Louise. Hopefully she is, as she said, she is in the middle of nowhere on some island. So I think we'll go to Tom and then we'll come back to Louise. Tom, are you up for?
Yes.
That's great. Go for it.
Okay, well, I'm going to share my screen and see if I can take over from Louise.
Great.
Thank you, Jemima. It's great to be here in this little session. Just a quick introduction about Pearson Lloyd. Founded by myself and my partner Luke Pearson in 1997, so we're 23 or so years. As you described, our work has many scales across different types of space and product. I would say our heart is in furniture design, but that moves across lots of types of space. We're very interested in the nature of the human body and how it interrelates with its surroundings. I'm just going to minimize something because I can't see my slides. So you can see here the work mixes from public space design, services, spatial design, and furniture design. And it moves across those things. But the thing that connects our work together is maybe represented by these slides, which are these are 3 or 4 random images that we've collected over the last 15 or 20 years, and they all represent an idea where people are being framed by their immediate environment, and it's often physical. It's rarely architectural in this case, and it's rarely what you might call furniture. But there's a real interrelationship between the sort of micro environments that are created, which define the experience of that moment. The beach umbrella defines how the proximity of those around you. The confessional on the right is this very intimate but also very private binary experience. Chaucer on the top left, and a Taguna, which I will describe in a bit more detail in a minute, which is a meeting space from the Dogon people of Mali in West Africa. But this really is the sense of
the image at the moment of the umbrellas. I think we're all feeling that so much, and having seen all the kind of lockdown escape to the sea, that you really feel, and that idea of proximity that we weren't, that we're not allowed in the same way that we were. I think all of those images are incredibly descriptive in that way.
Yeah, and as you're rightly saying, all what we know, what is our previous normal, is completely under threat at the moment, which is the most extraordinary thing. The sort of intimacy that we are so used to, whether it's with strangers or with friends, is gone at the moment. And so you're right that these images all represent something that maybe is not available to us at the moment. A part of our work stretches from the workplace to hospital design, to urban design, to transport design. And actually we have this idea that anything outside the home is what we call public realm. So for us, public realm is the workplace, public realm is a hospital, public realm is a transport environment. And the reason for that is because we share the experience of those places are both private and public, and they're both with strangers and with friends. And there's an interrelationship between that, which is really fascinating. And sometimes the experience is a collective one, if you're in a pop concert or where you're sharing the experience. At other times, that experience is utterly individual. So you might be lonely or in love or crying, walking through a street, and actually those around you, you have no relationship to the people around you. But no one else knows that. And so that duality of experience between everyone sharing a single space is something that we're fascinated by, and we think it happens everywhere. As soon as you cross the threshold of your home, you're in this strange environment where you're sharing, but not knowing that you're sharing. And when designing those kind of public spaces, if you like, there is this relationship between function, i.e. a purpose of like this in Shibuya and Tokyo, a zebra crossing, but also behavior, because it defines the behavior of the collective, which we, again, find how do you manipulate behavior or nudge behavior or frame or choreograph behavior through thinking about those things. So that as a sort of high level, that's something that frames all our work. Even though we very rarely design public space, we come down, even when you come down to a room in an office, you're still dealing with those same functions.
I'm totally fascinated by the idea of thresholds at the moment. I mean, just the threshold from going from your private house out into the street. I think that we'll look at thresholds in a completely different way from now on, really.
Absolutely. So, as you mentioned, Jemima, this is a project that where we sort of co-created in a way when you allowed us to exhibit in Great Western Studios in I think 2015, and we created this installation called One-to-One. And this is the boxes that you now beautifully look after at the Now Gallery. What we were doing was we wanted to create something that would both inhabit the space of the Great Western Studios has this long 3-story high sort of atrium space that connects all the workspaces together. And we wanted to do something where we could test this idea of how furniture can help to choreograph space. So we created these I think 20 of these tubes of wood, which are sort of, each one is a sitting height. And then over the course of the week, I think, of the exhibition, or the 2 weeks of the exhibition, we started to create this collage of these things. It was almost like a Lego. And each day we went down to the gallery space and we moved these boxes around. And then we filmed and we recorded how people started to inhabit them. And it was really a test. It was testing the idea that there's a natural behavior in people's environments. And as designers, we can just be a part of it, but actually people start to make sense of their own spaces, make sense of their own functions. And it was a lovely, free kind of expression of that, something that runs through all our work. And we were very happy to do that.
No, it worked so well, and it really filled the space in a way that nothing else had filled it. It was a really successful show. It was lovely.
So another project that's very close to our hearts is we have a furniture client called Bene in Austria, and they commissioned us to design some furniture for new meeting environments. That was the brief. It was 13 years ago, and we were, rather than doing research within the office environment, we really dived into understanding how social experiences have been set up in any other space, whether it's the beach or the confessional that we showed you, or I showed you at the beginning of the presentation. And my wife Polly has done many years of research in Mali in the Dogon region, and I spent some time with her in 1996 visiting that community. And one of their most important types of space is called a taguna, which is this meeting space for elders that are perched, really literally perched on the rock face. They have this very, very low ceiling and this very thick panel of millet stalks, which absorbs the heat. And one of the reasons for the low height is if ever there's an argument, you stand up, you hit your head on the ceiling and you sit down again. And it's like a peacemaking object. And we were just fascinated by that principle. And just that sense of how behavior, again, coming back to this idea that how space and behavior are so linked. So we started to think about that in terms of furniture, and we sketched out these various ideas around not mimicking really, but framing a particular behavior within a furniture environment. And the final object that came out was this is one of the series that came out, which is quite a sort of formal meeting space, if you like. But the one on the right particularly is only 1.5 meters high. And we wanted to really control the ergonomics of the space in a different way. So you actually have to duck into this, a duck in and duck out and sit down. And it really changes your behavior in a particular way. And this has been, amazingly, selling for the last 13 years, throughout Western Europe. And people were complaining that you would bump your head when you entered this space, but actually we said no one bumps their head when they get in and out of a car. You just, your habits change, and you work out how to do that. And the same was here.
Isn't it about being cozy?
Well, it was also about not having people, tall men, if you like, dominating a space by standing up always. So we were really interested in the democratizing the space by forcing everyone to sit. And that was something that we were really interested in. And it really also changes the acoustics when you have this low space. Another project within the sort of urban environment was the City of Bath. We designed all the street furniture and the wayfinding for the City of Bath about 7 or 8 years ago. And just 2 or 3 little pointers here which were interesting. We had this idea of Bath is held in a perfect geometry of sort of geography of a bowl. It's a very contained city, and it's contained geographically, and it's also contained in terms of its urban fabric. And we developed this idea of a circular map. And then subsequently we found this circular map from 1780 or something, which represents the sort of heart of the city. And we were really, really interested in that. And actually, once you frame the city in this circle, people could understand the edges in a very particular way. And we began also to look at these ideas around the compass, for example, or the watch, where you actually, you see the edges on the edge, just like a bezel on the watch. The edge of the map also describes what's beyond that. And so that sense of understanding of your context was very particular and very interesting in this project. There was a series of scales of object that sort of led you through the city. The city was very worried about contemporary design entering into the city. And so we created these bronze monolithic products that very calmly sort of relate to the city in a particular way. And just a small story about materials, Jemima, you were interested in. And we did all these panels are made in bronze, but actually bronze is a kind of passivated brass. So we used an acid treatment onto the brass to discolor it and to start the oxidization process. When we installed the first pilots, one thing we really didn't predict was that when a dog came past and peed on the side of these bronze panels, we had this perfect green arc. The pee hit the acid, it changed, it oxidized in a different way, or the alkali or whatever it was. So we had these arcs all the way across the city where dogs had lifted their legs on the edge of these panels. So we ended up developing this etched pattern on the bottom of the panels, which mimics the arc of the pee. So we used the pattern of the dog pee to describe and to build the sort of patina of the object. And one of our designers actually had to spend some time peeing onto these panels in our backyard of our studio to try and kind of test and research and prototype the experience of urine hitting this bronze material.
Fantastic. I was also going to say that we were talking about thresholds, but also boundaries. It's true that, you know, as soon as you put a boundary on something, you kind of can make sense of it, which you've done so beautifully here.
Yes, it really has it does change your sense of the city, because also the commissioning body really wanted to promote walking in the city, but wanted to give people the sense of how far they could walk, because people would arrive by train in Bath and then they would take a taxi to the Royal Baths, not knowing it was only 300 meters away. So a big part of this project was encouraging people to walk through the city and experience the different amazing spaces like the Royal Crescent or Queen Square, not only finishing at the Abbey and the Roman Baths. So that was a lovely project for us.
And also, we're doing some wayfinding on Greenwich Peninsula, and it's really hard to do, because it's how do you have an object which works, you know, infinitely, that you don't have to sort of change after, you know, that looks good for a long time, rather than, you know, looking good and sort of being digital and working, you know, how do you make it last?
Well, this particular project was exactly driven around that. So this bronze material you can actually scour with a scouring brush from your sink, and it will repatinate. So actually, when you want to go and clean it, you actually improve it by scouring it. One thing we didn't realize is that also the seagulls in the town when they go to the toilet, they throw on an angle their waste onto these kennels. But we did a lot of work about what materials would really last 40 years. And the same goes for the, we did these benches, which are in bronze and hardwood. And the wood we created just with a standard cutting tool, so that in 20 years' time, anyone could repair it. It was really, we wanted to make sure that there was a sense of purpose and a sense of longevity in this work. The bronze never needs painting, and the wood is easily repairable. So these sort of ideas were really built completely into this process. Just one small observation here that was very relevant to what I'm trying to describe here is this: we had one armrest here because we realized that very rarely do 3 people ever sit on a bench. Either 2 sit on a bench or one person sits on a bench. And we were trying to work out how you could encourage a single person and then a couple to sit on the bench who didn't know each other. So we created this single armrest 1/3 in. And then this was, we took this photograph when the first prototype was put in, and it was just a lovely sort of memory of our thinking expressed very clearly, that just that one piece of metal somehow gave people enough sense of safety that they could occupy very close to a stranger, a particular bit of public realm, and not feel threatened by it. So that rolls back into that earlier thinking.
Now, Tom, I'm going to be a tough
Running out of time, yeah.
We've got Louise back on track, back here. You've probably got another 5 minutes if you're lucky. So
I think I'm nearly there actually, Jemima. So all good.
I have to remind everybody, we would love questions from you. It's really, we want to know you're there. Any thoughts you have, any queries, any questions? It'd be really lovely to hear from you.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So I think this is the last project. Actually, there's a tiny bit about COVID. We worked with the National Health Service and the Design Council on a project called A Better A&E, and it was about how to, there was a huge problem about violence and aggressive behaviour in A&E departments in the UK, and it was often between the staff and the patients and visitors. And we were trying to think about what that meant. There was a lot of research about security measures, and they did conflict resolution training, better locks. They had something called a vomitarium, where you put drunk people to go into this room and are sick for the night. And so they had all these reactive measures, and we came in and started to talk to them about the social kind of construct of a group of people. And we came to the conclusion actually that people feel under threat because they feel out of control. And if you give them control, their sense of control will reduce their anxiety. So the project ended up becoming an information system which just simply tells people where they are in the pathway of their care. And we actually spent all this time in the studio, because we're not healthcare specialists, we went back and really tried to understand what was the pathway of care in an emergency department. And then we suddenly realized, we did this as an internal piece of work, and we suddenly realized that actually if we gave that information to everyone, maybe that would be a part of the solution to get to empowering people through knowledge. And so we created these huge map panels, with an information system that feels like a kind of journey planner. And it simply takes you through a series of steps, from checking in to your triage, to your care, to your sort of outcome. And we've been working on this nearly for 10 years now, and it's become a really successful project. And it's in now 22 hospital trusts around the UK. And it's had a huge impact on the way in which people communicate from the healthcare professionals, the clinicians, to the users of that service. And it was so, as a sort of piece of service design, has had a big effect on our thinking and the way in which we see what the boundaries of design might be. Designing for service provision in the public realm is something that we're really fascinated by. The last piece was COVID, and we wrote an article called Makeshift, which was about this idea that as soon as this huge crisis overwhelmed our lives 3 months ago, 4 months ago, we all became improvisers. The solutions were very much an improvisation, whether it's where you worked, how you traveled, where you lived, how you got your food. And this idea of a makeshift community or a makeshift society came into our sort of thoughts, that we're having to reinvent. And we're also, as Louise was saying, actually you can't design a city for 20 years because it'll be different in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. And so, but this is happening at a sort of micro level. Even every month we're going through the crisis, our relationship to the city changes from fear to confidence, back to fear to, and this idea of, as you said, safety. What does safety mean? And so we're absolutely fascinated by this network of pattern making on the streets around us now, where people are in a very personal way trying to manage this physical distancing that we've all been having to comply with. And also, just finally, last slide, was the nature of the city is somehow changing. Clearly the image on the bottom is actually a sort of design intervention to try and frame the idea of social distancing. Actually, it's just the same as the umbrellas for the beginning of the slide, which we've always done. You put an umbrella in the sand and you feel safe. You feel like you've defined your space. Whereas this is a sort of reaction to that process. But even the sense of, on the left, an empty city is it feels very threatening. On one level, it feels very beautiful and poetic when in April, the skies were so clear and the birds were singing brighter than ever. But actually, this empty city became quite perplexing to everyone. And also just this queuing, this was an image I took probably in the early phases. Suddenly this new culture of queuing and this new culture of separation has sort of shifted the social dynamic of the city in a fascinating way. And I think it's something that we're all having to make sense of, and maybe they become permanent, parts of our life, or maybe not.
I think the whole idea that we're improvising all the time is spot on. I think that's what we're doing. Now we're going to go back to Louise, and I just think it's really interesting what you all seem to be talking about as designers is the nature of being human, and also about communication. I thought the hospital designs, it's about how do you communicate ideas clearly, which I think you did. Louise, do you want to go back? Sorry about that. That's so frustrating. I've had the same experience.
Well,
Mid-rant and being cut off, so just go ahead. And everybody, just to remind you, we are here for questions. Do let us know if you would like to ask anything. Louise, go ahead.
So do you both hear me and see my screen again, right? Let's cross our fingers. So I lost connection, came back in as you were talking about thresholds, because I think that was what I was getting to, that I think in the city, this is the most interesting section. So we look a lot at what we defined as the threshold zone. So that whole zone, that is the transition between the private and the public, the transition between the open space and the built form. And I think that's where a lot of the really, I guess, the essence of urban design lies. This is where everything comes together. So this is an extremely interesting section, cross-section of the city. And I think I would just continue on with a sort of a small narrative of why streets are so amazing. And I think it ties into what next and how do we treat our cities with this whole COVID. So it's just a small sort of almost like cartoonish thing of streets are this very durable space that I think when we look at our cities, I think that it has an amazing potential. And I think that's where we should be focusing our efforts, because if we do great streets, we are actually influencing the experience of everyday life of everyone. We all use the streets, and they are a democratic space that, if done well, they can actually make sure we arrive at work happy and not stressed, or we meet friends and so forth. There's an amazing potential. And I think it's just, historically, our streets are also durable. So they've stayed the same. We have, in Copenhagen, we have streets that are 400, 500 years old. And basically you can replace the buildings, and you can actually upgrade the street as our needs change. So for an example, there's a sort of an explosion of people wanting to do more bicycling. So you can actually introduce bicycle infrastructure into our streets. Right now we're talking about climate adaptation. We're seeing more green in the city, sort of the urban nature coming back in. Streets can be the carrier of a lot of those elements. And we see more and more this streets being part of the bigger network in the city. So we can actually adapt into a lot of the needs we see in the city can actually be adapted into our streets. And then I think it also has something to do with this more democratic space, that we all are invited into the streets. Nobody is excluded if we do it right. So the streets are where we all have a say. And if we do it right, we start with the slowest and the most fragile users. We start with the pedestrians. And we know if we get our streets right for the pedestrians, it's much easier to then start to looking at bicyclists and their need, and in the end, the vehicles, the public transport, and sort of building our streets in that sense. So we are actually prioritizing the slow moving traffic and that whole working with that threshold zone. So I think that's where we see now a move towards demanding more of our streets, from not just being transport corridors, but actually being spaces of interaction where we can get inspiration, where we can meet and engage. And I think that's an extremely interesting journey to go on. And I think especially with the whole, we're talking about creating safe spaces, how do we actually look at our whole ground floor units and how they interact with the street? We're seeing a challenge with what's happening with COVID, shops closing down. What's the next stage for our street? Isn't it time now to renegotiate how we use that space? And I think in many cities, there's been a demand for more bicycling, less vehicular movement. And I think that's just at a point where that is really interesting. If we start zooming in at the streetscape, they are taking up 1/3 of all our built space. So I think this is key to start here.
I listened to there was a seminar that you did in St. Louis, and bringing people talking about this particular street space. And I'm not sure if it was your comment, but there was certainly a comment about benches, which I absolutely loved, which was, you have a bench and someone starts sleeping on it. Well, then just put another bench, or put another bench. You know, I thought that kind of democratizing of space is really key.
Yeah, that was my comment. And I've always enjoyed that, because you can go two ways. If you have an issue, you can try solving that issue by taking things away. And I think that's wrong. If you have an issue, put more invitations out. So if you don't want a person taking up the bench by sleeping, put in more benches, make more invitations. And I think that's something we should look at also after COVID. Understand the user and understand how you can invite more people, and then renegotiate the space. I think there is now an opportunity, and I think we have seen, by all being forced to sit at home, we have seen the value of our public realm and how we've all been longing for it. And I must say, I quite enjoyed it felt like a bit more respectful behavior, actually. I saw that in Copenhagen, that people were actually opening the door and waiting for you to pass before. And I quite liked that, where we sort of were forced to be a bit more polite in navigating in the public realm. I think that's, that's something that would be nice to hold on to a bit. But the worst that could happen was if we say that we can't really use public space for anything anymore because we're too afraid to use it. So I think it's definitely tying into a bigger discussion of what we want to do now. And so I thought I'd just end on a couple of examples of street projects. So apart from us looking at all the public realm of the design district that I'm not going to speak about here, I was going to just look at very quickly 5 streets or projects where we looked at streets. So a sort of a bit of different things. We've worked in London on the Biscuit Factory, where we looked at a network of streets and why is that important. We've worked in Berlin on turning a street from a vehicular street into a pedestrian street. We've looked at one of the most important streets in Copenhagen. We've looked at climate adaptation and developing elements in Middelfart in Denmark. And then we've looked at creating local ownership in the city of Kolding. So it's 5 sort of different approaches, but it's all about streetscape design and how we live that experience. So we were hired by Grosvenor to actually look at a sort of a hierarchy of streets and a bit of a brief for the architects of the Biscuit Factory in Bermondsey. I was just to show you, these are sort of early studies, but it's back to the whole idea of framework. I think streets should be what builds the frame before we start talking about the architecture. So we tried to actually say the street characters is this, and you now need to design your built form so that supports the character of the street that we need here. So this street needs to go from A to B, and it has a character of Main Street, for an example. So it's just to show a couple of examples. Then it's the link along the viaduct. It should have this feel, and it should be supported by this kind of architecture and street frontage. So it's just an approach where I think there is actually a merit to the street designer, if you can call it that, to come in first and say something about what is the streetscape we're looking for here? Who are the people moving here? Who are the people who will be populating this? And how can then the architecture after that support it? Because I think there is a tendency that we start with the buildings, we design the buildings, it's all great, but then we're left with something in between that has to sort of come in and do its thing. And in my opinion, the projects where we've been able to do this successfully, where we come in and look at the streetscape first, are the ones with most success afterwards. So that's definitely as an approach we're trying to promote. In Berlin, we were hired to look at Potsdamer Platz and the streetscape there. The client says, we have 100,000 people coming every day to Potsdamer Platz and we don't know why. There's not a single bench. And so we had the opportunity to actually start talking about what if we actually turn this, it's called the Alte Potsdamer Straße, what if we turn this from a vehicular street into a pedestrian street? With 100,000 daily visitors, that should be possible. So that was quite an interesting process of also talking about how do you do that? How do you make sure that the space has something to offer? How do we look at seating opportunities? It can't be a tiny bench when you know you have this huge an audience. So a lot of conversations about the furniture and all the elements that had to go into that public realm. Third project, which is quite almost opposite, is the street called Nørrebrogade in Copenhagen, which is the street that has most bikes in Copenhagen. So it has more than 40,000 bikes a day. And it's such a success. You've been able to get rid of most of the vehicles to invite bikes. But now we're actually at a point where the shops and the pedestrians in the street are complaining. Said, you took out the bikes, but you just gave us the cars, but you just gave us a freeway of bikes. It's impossible to cross the street now. So we were actually charged with how do you reclaim the street again for the pedestrians so that the bikes are actually starting to behave and actually respect the fact you could be standing on the sidewalk and wanting to get on the bus, but there was just no way you could get to the bus because there's just a wall of bikes and they're not stopping. And that's not good for the shops either. So, and that was quite an interesting because we're trying to promote bicycling all the time. But here it's almost like it's tipping and it's too much. So again, just an example of what do you do then? We try to sort of break the flow so you still have the same capacity, but you slow the pace and you make more connections across. Another sort of, and then I'm mindful of time here, but then we also looked at climate adaptation. And I think that's really where I think also you can integrate a lot of interesting elements and really looking at how can you add value to the public realm when you also do climate adaptation in streets. So we sort of developed a system, instead of digging up the street and introducing bigger pipes to carry all the water, we looked at a channel system where you put all the investment on the surface instead of underground. So that was a very interesting process where we worked with an asphalt manufacturer and sort of a water engineer specialist, and together had to develop this system of how can you actually, for the same amount of money spent, get added value. And I think that's one of the projects that I really enjoy because I think that's something we'll see going forward as well. Where do we put the investment as we design our streets? And I think the last one was a redesign of a street we did where we widened the sidewalks and we did a nice public realm. But what was really key in the end was that we developed a small catalog for all the shop owners in the street, because I think there is, and I think that's also an interesting discussion, there's a limit to how far we as urban designers and architects can go. But if we don't get the local ownership, the local buy-in, and if we don't get the users to actually take on what we've done and take ownership and take it forward, then we've not come very far. So what we did was we developed a small catalog of just basic rules of, if you have a shop, use the threshold zone. This is what the threshold zone is. This is what you can do. This is what will invite people in, and so forth. So a bit of a small guide, very simple, but just sort of remember to da-da-da. And it was an amazing process, because the shop owners took it on, and we would come back, and it's like almost overnight, people would have changed their fronts and opened their shops and put a small bench out and stuff. So I think that was a really nice experience, that we've provided the nice surface and the sort of everything within the public realm, but it's now up to you to take over and take ownership. So I think that concludes my swift through of
I think we want you designing every city in the world. I think it just looks ideal. And it's really exciting that you're designing the spaces for us in the design district. And I love the idea of sort of skirts. I mean, it's almost like if you really use the ground floor of buildings and make them so that they can kind of open up into courtyards, then people have to take on those courtyards and sort of respect them, which I think is really interesting. But also, if the materials that you're using for the space are good and interesting, and you kind of mark them out, I always imagine that when you come into the design district, you'll almost be able to hear that you're in a different place if you close your eyes. And I just think that is a really exciting thing to see. It's respect, really.
Louise, I was going to pick up on something you said around this idea of maybe doing the streetscape before the architecture, because I've always had maybe it's not only my problem, but when architects talk about placemaking, I think there's often an arrogance about it without too much knowledge or skill behind it. I mean, maybe I'm dissing an entire profession here, but there's a feeling that architects try to own the idea of placemaking, but I think it's a much more layered process. And as you say, defining the strategy before you start building is such a perfect, way round to do it.
Now, I know that there are rather a lot of questions, so if I could get you to stop sharing your screen, that'd be lovely, so everybody can see this. Magda, I believe, is there and is going to, first of all, we've got a Q&A which is coming up, so if everybody's up to answering that would be great. But we've still got some time for some questions. Magda, I know that some are on chat and some are on Q&A, so I'm wishing you lots of luck with that.
Thanks.
Go for it.
So the first one is from Kirsty, and she said, how do you think public art in the public sphere might play a bigger role in communities in a post-COVID world?
Good question. Do you use art in your work, Louise? Do you use artists to create space and sculptures that...
We do, but we always also try to give it a sort of a multiple purpose, so that it's not passive, but it's actually engaging and activating people. And I think especially with, there's this thing, if you're able to invite kids to use the city, their parents will come, and then bingo, you already have a user group presence. So I always like the idea of where you use art as a playful element, because you can do a lot more. If it's a playground, the list of restrictions is so long, but if it's an amazing piece of art that you can actually interact with, you don't have to do all the safety stuff you have to do with the playground. You can just put a small sign saying that it's at your own risk. So I think in that sense, I think art can actually liberate a bit, and it can actually help allow us to do stuff in the public realm that within the fixed we can't. So I think especially to get to add the playful element into the city, I think art is really valuable.
Tom, any thoughts?
Well, I'd share one thing Louise said, which is that we did all the street furniture for the city of Sheffield in 2003 to 2006. And actually, Sheffield is a traditional stainless steel city. So every single piece of street furniture for the last 30 years was fabricated in stainless steel. And actually, there was a sense of pollution about there was too much public art in the city, when actually all they wanted was good public service. And so we changed the dynamic to say, just actually a hard city like Sheffield just wants to have services that work well, buses to run on time, to be sheltered from the rain. And so we flipped that around a bit and tried to calm down the sense of public art in the city.
Mm.
Okay, the next one is from Madsen, and they say, how do you revitalise the street level when the shops, the interaction, the businesses are absent or closed? How can the spaces be utilised and create value and attractions for the pedestrians?
Yeah, that's not the first time I've come across that challenge, and it is a challenge. But I think we're at a point where we also need to sort of broaden our view on what the ground floor is. And I'm not talking about those very sort of residential areas. I'm talking about the streets where we do actually have a bit of commercial interaction, but I think we need to be clever about what happens. So we've also looked at, if a shop closes, you know, that has a very negative effect on the neighbors. So then you need to invite someone to come in. It could be art, actually. So you need to give away that space while you're waiting for someone to come and inhabit it and actually pay the rent. But in the meantime, you do need to activate it. And I think we will see more, our cities becoming more multi-layered. We've seen people sharing shops. So the last street example I showed, you know, in that city, the wine store and the hairdresser were sharing the shops. You could buy your wine and you can get a haircut at the same time, but they could actually share the expenses for a shop. And I think we need to rethink what we actually do with that whole ground floor plane, because it is crucial. And it would be such a disaster if we see all our cities closing down and closing that whole, whether it also needs to then have a component of residential. I think we really need to think hard about what should happen in that ground floor level, because something will have to happen to keep that. And I think it comes back to also creating the safe spaces, is having something, some kind of interaction. It doesn't have to be 24/7. It doesn't have to be a circus, but it does need to have that, again, that you can, signs of life and inhabitation. I think that's key. So
I think there was, in fact, Hackney has a very good thing called Appear Here, where they give vacant shops to artists exactly to do that, so and to startups. And I think that's a fantastic sort of campaign. But I think one thing was interesting I read was that the high street is becoming the only functions of high streets are what you can't get on the internet. And so tattoos and coffee are two things that you can't buy on the internet. And so that's why you get, and actually maybe we need to sort of heighten the social or the physical. Those environments become very different, because it's not where you hold stock of trousers or skirts or t-shirts, because why would you do that? It's just an entirely superfluous need to actually stock your clothing in a high street now. It becomes really a part of the social fabric of the community.
And it is putting a new demand on the actual shop and the shop owners to rethink, what is my shop? So if you have a shoe shop, you know, the experience of trying on the shoe will have to be extraordinary, because otherwise you just buy it online. So I think there's also there's this whole who are inhabiting that whole ground floor plane. They need to come into a whole new conversation of how do we create experiences that aren't business as usual.
And I think that whole idea of hybrid spaces, of functions changing. There's a lot of, there are pubs that are post offices in London and doing life drawing. You go to a pub to do life drawing classes. And that's that sense of diversification. It's like farming has diversified to sort of repurpose their land. And I think it's exactly the same thing. That you need an entrepreneurial spirit within that fabric of the street.
No.
Magda, we've probably got time for one more question or two, maybe at the most. Do you want to?
Okay, so this one has just come in from Nirma. They say, are some cities like London or NYC just too large and too densely populated? How do you resolve issues with overcrowding, especially in the view of what's happening at the moment with the protests and street parties and illegal raves? Are there design ideas that can help with this?
Good question.
I think I'll just jump in on that. I think it's interesting. I live in Hackney, where there's a famous park called London Fields that just had an alcohol ban because of the rave problem. And they went to the High Court on Friday to ban alcohol in the park, which is maybe not happened in 100 years. But actually, it's interesting, it felt like a very, very heavy-handed thing to do, but it did allow the rest of the community to reclaim that park. Just instantly families came back. It became a different social experience. I don't think you need legislation to do that, but it's interesting that as you close a street, the traffic finds another way. It either disperses or it disappears. So I think it is possible to program the street environment to manage density more than we think, especially with car use. I think car use is slowly disappearing, not in the COVID world, because now people are driving in order to stay away from public transport. But I think it is possible to manage that busyness and manage that flow.
And I think it ties into the whole negotiating and being careful with how we use our open spaces.
Yeah.
Do we really want 1/3 to be for cars?
Yeah.
You know, it's such a precious resource. And I think the worst thing we could do is start actually building sprawl. You know, we still need the dense city with the big challenges we're looking at with the whole climate change. We still need to be fairly dense, but we need to value our public realm and our open spaces much more, and not just leave it to coincidence that this much space is tarmac and left for cars. I think now is the time that we can really start asking those questions. How do we actually use that very valuable, precious resource? So I think it's actually a question of, it's a bit like with the bench. You don't take the bench away, you add 3 more. So be very precious with the space you've got, and basically give people more opportunities to come out and use that space.
Magda, do you want to ask one more? Have you got one more, or?
Yeah, maybe the first one that came in, someone that's remained anonymous. But it's, what is your definition of urban fabric?
Wow. What's that mean?
Well, I would say it's basically the built form. It's the fabric. So if you zoom out and look at the city, it's how it's made up of the network of streets and spaces and green spaces and built form buildings, and that makes up the whole urban fabric. So how that whole everything is tied together. That's in my sort of perception when I talk about urban fabric, and especially when what is urban. That's also sort of a bigger question, but it's as soon as you start becoming a bit more dense and it's more built than open space.
And I think it's also that the gaps between the buildings are, as you said, Louise, almost more important than the buildings themselves. So it's not, you know, traditionally we think of cities, buildings making cities, but it's actually everything else that's the bits that we inhabit.
Yep.
I think that's all we've got time for. Thank you so much for asking questions. That's always lovely. It's lovely to know you're out there. Thank you. I mean, I've had the sort of idea of being able to do this fantastic summing up, but I can't. But there's just so many, you know, thinking about chemistry and thinking about the importance of villages and the nature of humans and what space means to us and the democratizing of space and improvising and what does safety mean. I mean, you know, I've got so many questions to ask you still, so it's been really fantastic. Thank you so much, Tom and Louise, for coming and joining us this evening. I wanted to flag up to everybody that we've got our last talk in the digital series, and then we're going to be back in the gallery, hopefully all being well, in September. And Kaya Charles is going to be in conversation with Nina Manandar and Theo White, and the talk's called Challenging the Aesthetics of Youth, and they will be sharing their collection of photographic works which navigate evolving British youth subcultures. It's on the 21st of July, and it's at 7 p.m. and it's going to be really good. So a final thank you to Magda and Alicia for being now gallery. Thank you. And for you two from Copenhagen and Hackney. It's a treat to have you, and I've really enjoyed this talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Jemima.
Yeah, thank you.